Pathos is another appeal, points to the emotional aspect of our language, words, assumptions. It means using emotion to persuade your audience in some kind of way. It counts on an emotional response, i.e., pity, compassion, anger, excitement, nostalgia, narrative stories, bringing someone into a direct story, trying to draw the audience into a step by step experience of a story or experience to bring the audience to the author's side and to their claim. For instance, we see this a lot in political speeches, oftentimes in really emotionally heightened situations such as school shootings, where we see politicians talking about gun control and really evoking the emotional response of the audience to really try to gear them towards the author's argument or towards what they want the outcome or conclusion of the argument to be, whether it be stricter gun control, stricter school control when it comes to visitors, whatever the case may be. But we see this a lot. And something that it's very interesting, actually, that most incoming academic writers tend to, when they start writing academic papers, still infuse their papers with emotionally heightened words. And we have to train ourselves to take those words out. We have to train ourselves to make everything objective and neutral and show no bias, no response, no attitude, belief, perception, or attachment. We have to be an objective third party so that the logic will present itself, so that the data will present itself. So the idea of pathos or emotional appeals is to make sure that we understand when an argument is using emotion or emotional words or emotionally charged language or words that are very heightened to pull at the heartstrings of the audience, to also evoke the values of the audience. For instance, if the audience has a certain political affiliation, say, for instance, a Democratic or Republican rally, then certain words could be used to really evoke an emotional response that's rooted in the heartstrings or rooted in the values of that particular audience, which will, in essence, provide support for the rest of the argument to come. And so pathos is very important, very separate from credibility, but still, it's part of the triangle. There has to be a balance. There has to be equilibrium here. It has to be an equilateral triangle to present an effective argument or to achieve exigence. Here's an example of pathos. The Arctic is experiencing faster melting. If this Arctic ice were to go, sea level worldwide would go up 20 feet. Here's Manhattan. The World Trade Center Memorial would be underwater. Think of the impact of a couple 100,000 refugees and then imagine 100 million ellipses. We have to act together to resolve this global crisis. Our ability to live is what is at stake. We can clearly tell from this excerpt that the language is emotionally charged. There is a feeling of urgency instilled in this particular excerpt. The audience feels like they need to do everything they need to do because of the way that this is formatted and framed, right? Think of the impact of a couple 100,000 of refugees and then imagine 100 million. Think of the implications or the effects, if you will. And so it's really pulling at the heartstrings, the values, the what if, and then extremes, if you will. So this is an extreme version of pathos or appeals to pathos or emotion, really, really making someone see the last minute terrible conclusion of a situation or implication of a situation in order to make them act or think differently or adopt a different attitude or belief. And so that's pathos, its own separate pillar. We can ask the following things to determine whether a pathos or emotional-based appeal is effective. We can ask, how vivid is the author's language? How emotionally charged is the language? How emotionally heightened is the language? We can also ask, what kind of anecdotes or stories does the author include that seem intended to appeal to emotions? So oftentimes in political speeches, we see that politicians refer to exact, specific narrative stories, walking someone through a day in the life and a certain experience of a person, going through the traumas of a certain experience of just one person, but not a generalized whole. When you have a certain work, an academic work that's based on just narrative stories like that instead of actual systematic data that proves a certain point, then it's not so much credible or ethos based. It tends to be more pathos based, right? It's more emotionally driven. Another question is, should the author be using other modes of appeal? We ask this with every single appeal. If you are making appeals to pathos or emotion, are you making enough data-driven appeals? Are you making enough logos or logical appeals? We have to aim for an equilateral triangle. We need equal amounts of all of these things in relation to our audience, purpose, and context to make an effective argument. Another question, are there any other assumptions that are emotionally loaded or based on the audience or context? In other words, is the arguer making an assumption based on the political affiliation or social affiliation or race or gender that they would assume they would automatically agree with, which would bring them to the arguer's side automatically? It is that ethical. It's a question for you as an academic. Logos, the most confusing of the three appeals to persuasion, refers to logic, appeals to logic, appeals to logos, relies upon reason or logic. When appealing, let me go back here, click too fast. Oh my goodness. You all, I'm working on a very old laptop here. Hold on, let me see if I can go back. Pathos, logos. Here we go. So when we ask ourselves about logos or logic, we're talking about reasoning. Is the information logical? Does it follow an organizational pattern that we can all follow? Does it make sense? Are there any fallacies or biases apparent? The questions that we ask on a base level when it comes to appeals to logos are, how rational are the author's claims? Are they logical? Are the thesis statements just outlandish to begin with? Are they making outlandish claims that we know data wouldn't support? Are the ideas logical? Are the main points followed? Do the main points support anything relevant to the main idea in the argument at all? Do the subpoints just not follow? Or is there no evidence, or does the reasoning process just not follow through from the if to the then? That would be an issue. Does the author have enough information to support his or her argument? This is a common issue in introductory academic writing. Is the writer providing enough information on a broad level to support his or her argument? Are they bringing in enough information to support every aspect of the argument? Finally, is the author's information typical, or is it so unusual that it really cannot be used to suggest the claims in the argument are generally true? This is taking a crazy exception to a normatic or normal rule and accepting that as a generalized conclusion. In other words, saying that it's snowing once every 5 years in Arizona to try to claim that global warming is not a truth. And so these are the types of things you would ask or inquire about when it comes to appeals to logos. To determine logos-based appeals and whether or not they are effective, we ask, how reliable are the author's facts? Is his information accurate? And you will notice that a lot of these appeals overlap. So for instance, logos and appeals to ethos will overlap. Credibility and accuracy of information will overlap a little bit, but they're still separate in their own degree. How reliable are the facts? Is the information accurate? Are the facts relevant and sufficient? Does the information the author is including actually have any bearing on his claims? Is the information relevant? Relevancy is very important because oftentimes we find that when someone is making a claim or an argument, they bring in miscellaneous or irrelevant ideas that do not support the claim explicitly. And so, no matter how many sideline ideas you bring in that might be related to the overall topic, if it's not related to the claim you're making, it's essentially superfluous details. It's just extra fluff that is not going to make an impact. In other words, it's static when it pertains to academic writing. And so when we determine logos, we have to ask, are there any of these I guess, superfluous details added into the conversation that would be white noise or static that's not really directly related to supporting the ideas of the main claim? Out of all three, it's very clear to be able to determine emotion. We can tell that through verbiage, wording, assumptions. We can tell ethos and credibility clearly by data, statistics, credentials, authoritative tone. Logos is the most difficult appeal to be able to understand because it's the most vague or ambiguous. Are there enough details? Fortunately, there is a criteria, what we call the STAR criteria. S for sufficient, T for typical, A for accurate, and R for relevant. We're going to talk about these criteria later, but I just want to introduce those. So, STAR, is the information or evidence sufficient? Is it typical, accurate, and relevant to the topic and claim being presented in your argument? So here's an example of an intersection of ethos, pathos, and logos all combined. I've tried to color code it so you can see it visually in front of you. I'll read it out loud. What is scarier still is the uncertainty about the truly extreme outcomes of climate change. Our own calculations estimate that there is a roughly 5% to 10% chance the eventual average temperature could be 6 degrees Celsius higher than pre-industrial levels rather than 3. I have hiccups all of a sudden. What this would mean is outside anyone's imagination, perhaps even Dante's, followed by the in-text citation of the source. So we can clearly see all three, the intersection or the combination of all of the appeals here. Look at the red text. These are the emotionally charged types of language that you see. Scarier still, uncertainty, outside anyone's imagination, perhaps even Dante's. And this is all creating a sense of urgency, right? It's pulling at the heartstrings, and the emotional words, emotionally laden words, it's going to really make the audience listen, right? Or adopt an attitude, belief, or an action. And then we look at the blue and yellow. Our own calculations estimate that there is a roughly 5% to 10% chance that the eventual average temperature could be 6 degrees Celsius higher than pre-industrial levels rather than 3. Well, the blue could be seen as appeals to ethos, right? Talking about calculations or data or reliable data, truthful data that cannot be refuted. And then the yellow would be your logic, really, your appeals to ethos. So really talking about if there's a 5 to 10% chance that the eventual average temperature could be 6 degrees Celsius higher as time progresses than pre-industrial levels at the same level as in industry is operating currently, then we could logically argue that that is going to be an increasing data point. Right. And so this excerpt kind of involves all of them. This is a good example of how we would make an argument and how we would intertwine all of those three appeals to be useful for our audience. We're going to talk more about these in-text citations that you see here. So if this is confusing to you or if you haven't seen it, we will cover that soon. There is an image referred to as the rhetorical triangle. This is a term used to describe the three major components of the communication situation. That's the author, the audience, the text, and the context. This refers back to our first day in class.